Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're going way, way back, like even before the pyramids, before written history even.
Wow.
We're going to explore the world.
Yeah.
The world before the biblical flood.
Okay.
And we've got some super interesting excerpts from this text. It's called pasted text.
Right.
And it really makes you think, like, what was life like back then, really?
It's wild, right? Like, these ancient texts, they paint this picture that's both familiar and, like, totally alien to us now.
Right.
You know?
Totally.
Like, imagine people living for centuries, centuries, with this deep connection to the divine. It's like a time capsule of early humanity.
And you've got to wonder, what could they achieve with all that time?
Right.
Centuries. Could they have had crazy technology? Or do they, like, stagnate? I mean, the source material, it even says they had this advanced knowledge, agriculture, animal husbandry. They built cities. They worked with metal, bronze and iron even. They had music.
It's it's mind-blowing to think about having that much time to refine a craft, to build relationships, to explore. But of course, that much time, it could also lead to conflicts, mistakes even, that could last for generations. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's like all that time to mess things up.
Exactly.
And speaking of, that brings us to some of the big names in this pre-flood world.
Okay.
We've got Adam and Eve, obviously, right?
Sure.
But not just as the first humans.
Yeah.
But as these people who live, like, insanely long lives.
Right.
The text says Adam was 930 years old.
That's incredible.
I know. And they had all these other kids. Besides Cain and Abel.
Right, right.
With their family tree, it would be massive.
Oh, huge. It's often forgotten just how vast their lineage would have been. It really changes our whole view of how those early humans interacted, doesn't it?
Totally. And then there's another figure that I find so fascinating, Enoch.
Oh, yeah.
He walked with God, right? And then he was taken from earth without dying.
Yeah, right.
That's different from any other figure in the Bible. I mean, what made him so special?
It's unique even in that time. Even with all the wonders happening, even in this, seemingly ideal world, there were different paths, different levels of connection to the divine. It makes you wonder what set him apart.
Yeah, totally. And it really challenges that idea that the world before the flood, that it was some kind of paradise.
Right, right.
Speaking of, we can't forget about Cain and Abel.
Of course not.
And, Cain's descendants. They became known for violence, straying from God. It's an early example of how our choices, they can have lasting consequences.
Absolutely. It's that classic struggle between good and evil. And it's there right from the start. Cain's lineage represents that darker side of human nature. And it really foreshadows the decline that was to come. And this is where things get really interesting.
Oh.
The text introduces the Nephilim. Have you heard of them?
Yeah. The fallen ones, or giants.
Yeah.
They're born from sons of God. Fallen angels, right? Or human women. It's like straight out of, like, ancient mythology.
Right. But the text, it doesn't treat them as myth. They're presented as a real presence in this pre-flood world, and maybe even contributing to that moral decay.
Wow.
Imagine living alongside these larger than life beings.
Right.
How would that change your worldview, your beliefs even? Would you fear them? Revere them?
Right.
It adds a whole other layer, doesn't it, to this already complex picture.
It does.
Yeah.
But it does highlight that the pre-flood world, even with the long lifespans and the advanced knowledge, it wasn't, a utopia. The text quotes Genesis, saying that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time.
Wow.
That's pretty bleak.
It's a stark picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't all sunshine and roses back then.
Yeah. Definitely not. And that's what makes Noah's story all the more important. Here's this righteous guy, chosen by God, to survive this coming flood. Think of the faith he must have had to build this massive ark while everyone else was caught up in all this wickedness.
Yeah. It must have taken a ton of conviction to actually do what God said.
Yeah.
Especially with everyone else, doubting him. And speaking of God's instructions, let's talk about the ark itself.
It's okay.
It wasn't just some random boat, right?
Hey.
This was a huge undertaking, and God was involved in every detail.
Right.
Size, the materials, like gopher wood. Anyone know what that is?
I really wondered about that.
And then the instructions on who to bring, what animals to bring.
Yeah, and what's up with clean and unclean animals anyway? Like, what makes them different? It's fascinating, right? The text implies clean animals were those good for sacrifice. Like there's some hierarchy in creation itself. And that leads us to a key point. The ark, it represents the first covenant between God and humanity. It's that promise of survival in exchange for obedience.
Okay, so we've got this picture of the world before the flood. People living for centuries, fallen angels, giants roaming around, wickedness everywhere. And then Noah building this massive ark, all because of his faith. It's a lot to think about. But where do we go from here?
Well, now we get to the flood itself, a catastrophic event.
Yeah.
That reshaped everything. Are you ready to dive into that?
Yeah, I think we're ready for the flood. This is where things get, well, pretty intense, right?
It's a big turning point for sure.
Like a total reset for the world. Wipes out everything except Noah, his family, and the animals. It's a pretty heavy idea.
It is. It makes you think about divine intervention, you know?
Yeah.
A world so messed up, it needs a complete cleansing.
Right.
But it's a reminder about how powerful nature is and how fragile we are.
That's true. Makes you wonder, did anyone even listen to Noah?
Right.
Or do they just think he was, like, crazy? Building this giant boat for no reason? I mean, the scale of this flood, it's hard to wrap your head around it.
It is. It wasn't just some local thing. The text says it covered the whole earth, mountains and all. And think about it. This was way before any modern technology.
Right.
Can you imagine the terror as the water kept rising, realizing there was nowhere to go?
It must have been terrifying. But, you mentioned the animals earlier.
Yeah.
What was the deal with the clean and unclean thing? Was it about what they ate?
Yeah.
Or how they acted? Or was it more, like, symbolic?
That's a question that's been debated for ages. The text doesn't really explain it. It just says Noah took 7 pairs of the clean ones and 2 of the unclean. Some people think it's about dietary laws,
Right.
Others think it's more about a spiritual hierarchy, like which animals were closer to God.
I see.
Imagine having to choose which animals deserve to be saved and which ones didn't.
Yeah.
What would you base that on?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
But okay, so the flood happens, it's over, everything's gone. It's like a blank slate. Like, what happens next? Like, what do you even do after that?
Well, the flood, it wasn't just about destruction.
Right.
It was about renewal, too. The text talks about a rainbow appearing after the storm.
Yeah.
And that's a big symbol of God's promise to never flood the world again.
I see.
It's a covenant of hope, a fresh start.
Okay, that makes sense. But if the flood was supposed to, like, wipe out all the bad stuff, why does it come back?
Right.
Later on in history, I mean, didn't everyone start over? Like, good. You'd think that going through something like that would change people, for good.
That's a great point. And it's because, well, human nature is complicated. We can be good, but we're also capable of being selfish, greedy, The flood didn't erase that. It just gave us another chance.
So if we think about it now, what can we learn from all this? We're not facing a literal flood, obviously, but there's a lot going on in the world. Climate change, politics, all that. It kind of feels like we're always in rough waters.
It does, doesn't it? And that's what makes the story so relevant. Even though it's, so old, it's a warning about what happens when things get too bad, when we forget about what's really important.
It makes you think about the choices we're making.
Right.
As individuals, as a society, are we building a world that's good? Or are we making the same mistakes as them?
That's a question we all have to ask ourselves.
Right.
The lessons from that time, they're still important. They're about faith, about listening to something greater than ourselves. It's about making choices that lead to a better future.
It's easy to get overwhelmed when you see what's happening, But we do have the power to make a difference.
We do.
Even small things like being kind, making ethical choices, they all matter.
Exactly. We don't always realize how much our individual choices matter, but together they really do shape things. Just like the people back then, we have the power to change the direction we're headed.
There's this one thing about the ark that I've always wondered about. That gopher wood. What was that all about? Was it, like, magical or something? Did it have special powers? Why did God tell Noah to use that?
It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? The text doesn't really say. Some people think it was a kind of wood that doesn't exist anymore. Others think it might have been cypress or cedar, woods that are really strong and waterproof. It's fun to think about. It's like this little detail holds a secret about that whole world.
Yeah, it does. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises, Unanswered questions, stories we haven't discovered yet. Maybe someday we'll find a piece of that gopher wood and finally figure it out.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.
But for now, it's one of those fascinating mysteries that we're left with.
Yeah. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. From the Garden of Eden to the Nephilim, a world full of wickedness, and then the flood, you know, wiping everything clean. It's crazy to think how all this shaped history and how it's still relevant to us now. But what about those other people mentioned in the text? Like Seth, Methuselah, all those names. What about their stories?
You're right. We tend to focus on the big names, but it's important to remember that world was full of people, each with their own experiences. And that brings us to a really important point.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the main characters you know, but there were all these other people mentioned in the text, like Seth, Methuselah, all those names we kind of skip over. What do their stories tell us about this pre-flood world?
That's a good point. These old stories, they give us these glimpses into this world, full of individuals. Each one had their own experiences, their own impact. It makes you think about the lives that were lost, the lessons they learned, the legacy they passed on. We're talking about thousands of stories, maybe, all of them part of this ancient world.
And think about how long they lived. Methuselah was, what, 969 years old?
That's hard to imagine.
I know. It's hard to even grasp, experiencing time that way. Did they even age the same as us? Did their view of life change after living for centuries?
It's a fascinating question to think about, all that knowledge they'd gather, the relationships, the perspective after all that time. But then you got to wonder about the downsides, too. Would they get bored, tired of it all, maybe even longing for something more?
Maybe that's part of why the world got so bad.
Yeah.
Too much time, not enough to keep them busy.
It's possible. Or maybe it was having that much time that led to the complex societies, the advanced knowledge, and then ultimately to the moral decline that brought about the flood. It's like every gift, every opportunity comes with a responsibility to use it well.
So looking back at all of this, what are the big takeaways from exploring this world before the flood? What can we learn from it for today?
For me, it shows how history repeats itself, Civilizations rise and fall. The fight between good and evil never ends. And our choices, they always have consequences. It happens over and over again, and we're not exempt from it.
It also shows how powerful stories are, these ancient tales, passed down for generations. They still shape how we see ourselves, how we see the world, our place in it. They remind us that we're not just individuals, we're part of something bigger, this long story of human experience. It's pretty humbling.
It is. It shows that what we do, our choices, they have an impact far beyond our own lives. We're part of something much bigger, connected to the past and shaping the future.
That's a powerful thought. So, as you're going about your day today, maybe think about those ancient people, the giants, the Ark. And remember, even in a world that seems so long ago, there are lessons to be learned, stories to be told, connections to be made.
And maybe by understanding the past, we can make a better future.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive into the world before the flood. Until next time, keep exploring.